So good evening and welcome to everyone. It's great to see you all here virtually. I am indeed Frances Hellman. I'm Dean of Mathematical and Physical Sciences in the College of Letters and Science at UC Berkeley. I'm also a professor of physics. Of course, I really do wish we were all meeting in person, but at least the silver lining to these virtual events is that we can reach so many of our alumni and friends who moved away from the Bay Area. So I'm delighted to be here this evening to bring together several faculty members and a graduate student from the Department of Earth and Planetary Science. For a very good reason, we here in the Bay Area, think a lot about the gliding of large plates over the Earth's mantle. And this department has led much of the geophysical science that has gone into this study. We will, of course, barely scratch the surface of plate tectonics, but our aim here is to show you some of the exciting work and the great researchers who are dedicating their lives to understanding our planet and its dynamics. So this evening, we are going to hear from 4 fantastic scientists who are making this leap, developing new theories and models that will help researchers around the world working to understand planetary science. Our moderator this evening is Michael Manga, the Garnes H. Curtis Department Chair and a professor in the Department of Earth and Planetary Science. He studies the geological processes that shape Earth's surface. This includes understanding the reasons why planets have volcanoes, why those volcanoes erupt in so many different ways, and how those volcanic eruptions affect climate and other Earth systems. He also studies how geological processes affect and are affected by groundwater, including the formation of geysers, the effects of earthquakes on fluid flow in the Earth's crust, and the origin of springs and mud volcanoes. Great stuff. He also studies similar processes on other planets, including the eruption of water on icy satellites in the outer solar system and deciphering the coupled history of water and volcanism on Mars. So take it away, Michael, all yours.
Thank you so much, Frances. This is indeed a pleasure for me to be here to moderate today and also to present some of my own research. Earth is a restless planet. Earth and planetary science does have broad expertise in most of Earth's natural hazards, earthquakes, volcanoes, landslides, and flooding. And today we'll share research directions being pursued to understand those hazards most directly connected to plate tectonics, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions. So we're now going to go through 4 presentations. Please ask your questions in the chat as they occur to you, and I'll do my best to pay attention to them and integrate them into the discussion. So I'll now ask Harriet, Roland, and Claire to tell us a little bit about their teaching and research in general, and their current research projects more specifically. And we'll begin with Professor Harriet Lau, an assistant professor in the Department of Earth and Planetary Science at UC Berkeley. She explores global-scale geodynamical problems across many timescales. This includes solid Earth and ocean tides. These act on hours to years. The deformation of the Earth due to melting of large Pleistocene ice sheets. This is years to tens of thousands of years. To mantle convection, the process that drives plate tectonics, millions to billions of years. And the theme of all this research is to understand how we can coherently characterize Earth's behavior across these vastly different timescales. So Harriet, can you tell us a little bit about some of your ongoing research?
Sure, let me just share my screen. View. Can everybody see the screen? Yep, fantastic. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us, and thanks Michael for the introduction. And a little bit about my group. I've been at Berkeley since 2019, so quite recently, and I'm slowly building a research group. My 2 PhD students here, we've not actually physically met yet, but we aim to derive mathematical and computer models, combining them with unique data sets to understand the global scale geophysical dynamics. And this is a picture of my current work set. Theoreticians are at the bottom of the pecking order when it comes to returning to campus. And so the theme of this evening is that we live on an active and dynamic Earth, where the surface of our planet is broken up into rigid plates that form a jigsaw puzzle. And for the last 50 years, we've understood the interactions of these plates under the theory of plate tectonics. And this extremely simple theory explains the vast amount of activity at the surface of our planet, including why volcanism occurs, why earthquakes occur, and where these happen. And where a lot of this action happens is right at the boundaries of these plates. And you'll hear more about this from my colleagues. And for us here at Berkeley, this is a matter close to home, as we have our very own local fault that cuts right through campus. And while this theory continues to stand the test of time, more and more intricacies are being discovered with increasingly new ways of observing our planet, including satellite-based technologies and global networks of seismometers, which we all will touch on here. But to really get at what drives the interactions of plates and the forces that result at the boundaries, an understanding of Earth's deep interior is required. And so in the figure on the left, we have a depiction of just what happens within the Earth. So about 3,000 kilometers of solid rock slowly creeps and is being heated from the top of the iron core and cooled at the surface. And we call this motion mantle convection. And in my own work, I focus on observations of tides and ice sheets, as Michael mentioned, to teach us about the interior of the Earth. And it turns out, with a technique known as seismic tomography, one can take essentially a CAT scan of the Earth. And so every time an earthquake strikes, seismic waves ripple through the planet. And if we time how long it takes these waves to ripple, we can use all these ripple paths to make an image of the Earth's interior, just like an X-ray. And so we've been doing this for decades, and two enigmatic features always show up in these images, and I've shown them here. These slow down the waves, and these features lie at the base of the mantle beneath Africa and the Pacific. And these are dome-like structures that rise about 1,000 kilometers above the base of the mantle. And when we think about the surface, these types of features deeply rooted in the mantle are fundamental to understanding what drives mantle convection. And one key parameter is how buoyant these structures are. And so while seismic images, while informative, they tell us whether seismic waves slow or speed up through the Earth, they tell us actually very little about the buoyancy of such structures, and which the buoyancy is really important because this really dictates whether rocks rise or sink. And so here are where the tides come in, and I'm not talking about ocean tides, though the forces are similar. Just as the moon warps the ocean surface to give us twice daily tides at beaches that we know so familiarly, so too does the Earth's solid surface. And so just as I speak, we're going up and down twice a day, about 40 centimeters. So just let that sink in. It makes me nauseous every time I think about it. And this warping is captured by GPS stations throughout the globe. And importantly, how the Earth warps in response to the gravitational pull of the moon depends a lot on the buoyancy structure of the deep mantle. And so observing this somewhat obscure phenomenon, we can make predictions like the one shown here on the right of just how buoyant the deep mantle is. And it turns out understanding the deep structure of the Earth is also important for other kinds of mass exchanges at the Earth's surface. And so one example I focus on is the surface mass exchange between changing water to ice, or sea level to ice sheets. And so here on the left is a prediction of how melting the Western Antarctic ice sheet will change sea level. And so we're interested in the Western Antarctic ice sheet because it's extremely vulnerable to climate change. So this color is normalized sea level change. And you can kind of think of this as if we were to melt the Western Antarctic ice sheet enough so that we have a millimeter change in globally average sea level, what would happen? And it turns out this sea level change varies geographically, and these colors show proportionally how much more or less sea level will change across the globe. And note the dramatic fall in sea level by the margin of the ice sheet itself. And so the inset that hovers over Antarctica emphasizes this fall more. It's counterintuitive, but the physics is as simple as Newton and the apple. And so here's a schematic diagram of an ice sheet and sea level. But what is more realistic is that the ocean is gravitationally attracted to the large ice sheet. And so once the ice sheet melts, that gravitational attraction is lost and sea level falls at the margins. But the bad news is that this fall has to be met with larger rise elsewhere. And so if you look back at the map on the left, The darker blue patches show places that will experience a sea level rise 60% greater than average. And this pretty much covers both coasts of the US. And so each ice sheet has its own map of sea level rise, and we call these fingerprints. We can also look back in time at past big melt events to learn about these dynamics also. And so 25,000 years ago, or 20,000 years ago, we were in the last ice age. And Canada, right down to Long Island, was covered in a massive ice sheet known as the Laurentide ice sheet. And since its disappearance, around 8,000 years ago, the northern part of our continent continues to rebound today at rates similar to plate tectonics, so roughly centimeters a year. And I'm showing you on the right a prediction of the rate of sea level change here today, even though the ice sheet melted thousands of years ago. And this map is a combination of the effects due to basically moving water from continent to ocean, but also the rebound of the crust, which essentially reshapes ocean basins globally. And the physics behind this is that the ice sheet weighs down and warps the crust, causing the underlying mantle to flow away. But once this ice sheet melts, the mantle flows back in the void that's left by the weight of the ice sheet due to these pressure changes. And so to summarize, a detailed knowledge of Earth's interior is required to understand so many processes that occur at the surface. And for me, Berkeley has provided me with a truly unique research environment where I'm able to explore these really interdisciplinary questions where we combine both the understanding of deep Earth physics with the changing environment of our climate. And so I'll stop here and happily take any questions.
Thank you so much, Harriet. You know, from a geoscience perspective, what you showed us is interdisciplinary. It involves the ocean, ice sheets, the solid part of the Earth, all the way down to the core. Is there any other type of interdisciplinary collaborations that your research enables?
Yeah, this is precisely the kind of really interesting aspects of my research that I've sort of faced. And so, for example, you could imagine if you, especially looking at the figure here on the right, where we have the imprint of that giant Laurentide ice sheet, turns out how exactly that ice sheet melted has really kind of important implications for archaeological studies of how humans migrated along basically the Bering Strait and made their way to the kind of bulk of the North American continent. It's interesting because we predict sea level to have a very distinct pattern. We find artifacts from Algonquin communities hundreds of meters out into the ocean around Chesapeake Bay, and that's because during the last ice age, sea level was so much lower. And so our predictions show that we should expect these ancient artifacts to be way beneath sea level. So that's one example. I don't know if maybe I should move on to the next question, but there are very interesting juxtapositions.
Boy, we have a very technical question. I'll go ahead and ask it based on our seminar yesterday. But does tomography give you a good enough resolution of what the inside of the Earth looks like? Or do we really have to move to high resolution techniques like full waveform inversion?
Oh, wow. That is a really great question. And someone who's very well versed in
our
the kind of
discipline.
the current state of the art in our discipline. And so, yeah, so, you know, I described this CAT scan of the Earth, and you'll hear more about it in a later talk. So perhaps Claire can kind of bring us back, but it really depends on what process we're interested in. And so the process I talked about being tides, it really is this kind of deep, kind of very planetary scale warping of the Earth on, you know, as I said, a planetary scale. So tiny differences that could be 50 to 100 to even hundreds of kilometers in the Earth. This kind of process almost doesn't see it. It kind of filters it out. And so for tides, it's not so important. But if we were to think about things elsewhere, kind of much more regional studies, we do have to move to much higher resolution models. And yeah, by full waveform, this for folks who've never come across that term, it's, you know, when we measure the deformation of the Earth because of in response to an earthquake, typically we might use only tiny bits of the data. But full waveform inversion is really just that full kind of what we call seismogram is being taken into account when we do these tomographic images.
So Harriet, one last quick question. Given your accent, you obviously grew up on a flat island. How did you then just get inspired to study the deep Earth?
Yeah, actually the contrast between the flat island and the extremely diverse continent of that the US is part of is actually a big reason. I have family in Texas and family in California. And, you know, just before applying to college, I had a really kind of formative trip, I guess, between Texas and California. And there's nothing that gives you a more nothing that makes you appreciate vastness more than driving through Texas. But obviously on the way I passed through things like the Grand Canyon, White Sands National Park. And so these things inspired me to understand how they were formed.
Thanks so much, Harriet. Okay, next up, Professor Roland Burgmann in the Department of Earth and Planetary Science leads the Active Tectonics Research Group, which is also affiliated with the Berkeley Seismological Lab. His research interests span geophysics and geology. His team uses satellite systems to measure crustal deformation associated with active faults, volcanoes, groundwater, and landslides. Some recent research projects have focused on observations and modeling of how the active earthquake cycle works and the deformation that occurs after earthquakes in California, Tibet, Iran, and subduction zones around the Pacific. Roland, can you share some of your ongoing and recent research?
Sure. Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. So a little over 31 years ago, I came to the Bay Area to start my PhD studies at a little college across the Bay. And just a month later, the Loma Prieta earthquake happened, October 17, 1989. And that earthquake changed the life of many people in the Bay Area in more or less unfortunate ways. It changed my life. It condemned the building I was working in, but it also changed the science I do. I came there to study structural geology, tectonics, looking at ancient deformation. And this earthquake really redirected my attention to active deformation, earthquakes, and plate tectonics. So 10 years later, I had the opportunity to come to Berkeley as a faculty member. And so let me tell you about some of the research that we do in our active tectonics group. And so let me start with a picture of our group, the active tectonics group, because without the undergraduate and graduate students, postdocs, visiting researchers, obviously none of the research that I'll share you a little bit with would be happening. Now, each member in our group works on a different system, earthquakes in different parts of the world, plate tectonic deformation, active landsliding, groundwater systems, volcanoes. But there are some common themes. And one is that we rely on space-based technology, namely the global positioning system that you heard already Harriet talk about. She used to measure the Earth's tides, and radar interferometry. So you all know GPS. You have probably a GPS receiver in your pocket. You use it to navigate yourself to your destinations. Well, we can use GPS with slightly more involved processing techniques and technology to navigate tectonic plates at few millimeter accuracy, using both observations where we set up instruments every few months or years, and more with permanent stations that are now distributed across the US and many other places in the world. And so with these positioning measurements, watching those over time, we can then determine plate motions and deformation across plate boundaries. So each arrow on this map shows the direction and the rate. This here is about an inch of motion per year relative to the stable interior of the US. And you can see the increasing length of these arrows indicates the increasing deformation as we go across the Bay Area, the plate boundary between the North American plate on the east and the Pacific plate to the west. Now, radar interferometry is based on space-based satellite radar observations. This technology was developed so we can take high-resolution images of the surface of the Earth, day or night, rain or shine, because it's self-illuminated. So it's using reflections, echoes of microwave signals from the surface of the Earth to create these kind of images. And we can keep coming back with the satellite flying over to see if change has happened. Now, in addition to this imaging capability, which is why these satellites were being put into space, the satellite also measures the phase where in the wave pattern of the returning wave that signal is when it arrives back at the satellite. Completely noisy, meaningless observation. It was not meant to give us anything. But now imagine if between the two times that the satellite flies over, the surface of the Earth deformed, and we take the difference of those two images, we end up with a map of deformation of the surface of the Earth, motions towards and away from the satellite, in this case associated with the Ridgecrest earthquake that shook Southern California last year. Each one of these fringes of this interferogram reflects about an inch increment of motion. We can count across that to end up with a contour map of deformation up to about a meter associated with that earthquake, which then we can turn into useful information about the earthquake. So with space geodesy, satellite-based technology, we can watch tectonic plates move. We can see North America rotating away from Europe at a rate of about an inch per year. We can see the broadly distributed deformation all the way from the Rocky Mountains towards California of about 2 inches per year between the North American and the Pacific plate. If we close up on the San Francisco Bay Area and use this radar interferometry technology to measure the longer term deformation, we can see this gradient in color or velocity away and towards us across the bay associated with plate tectonic deformation. We can see a few small red patches along the bay. These are compacting sediments, often man-made landfill that SFO, for example, is sitting on. We see deformation associated with aquifers, such as in the Santa Clara Valley or Livermore. And if you look across the bay along the Hayward Fault, you see a sharp break indicating that the Hayward Fault slips during these observations at a small amount. If we zoom in even closer here on our campus, you can again see the Hayward Fault here, different rate of motion towards and away from the satellite, consistent with that picture of the Hayward Fault creeping and cutting right through the Memorial Stadium. This was actually taken before the renovation. And then you see these red plobs here. These are active landslides in the Berkeley Hills moving downhill. So we can take the GPS measurements of deformation, the INSA measurements of deformation, and we can use computer models that allow us to map the surface deformation to slip on the Hayward Fault in the subsurface. So here we have a cut open view of the Hayward Fault watching from the side, from the surface to 12-kilometer depth. And the colors, the red colors mean the fault is slipping as time goes on. But you can also see deeper on the fault, where these yellow and light patches are, the fault is not slipping. And so this is where hazard is building up. This is the tectonic time bomb that eventually will have to catch up with the long-term plate tectonic fault motion of the fault, and hasn't done so in a long time. So we can take these models and estimate of how much the fault is not slipping at this in the subsurface and add up that slip deficit to see, well, how long would it take to have an earthquake of a given size? And so we find that every 100 years, the Hayward fault builds up enough of a deficit for a magnitude 6.8 earthquake. The last earthquake, roughly a magnitude 7 or so, was in 1868. That's 152 years. So this tells us the Hayward fault is very much ready to have an earthquake as big, if not larger, than the last one that we had. So using GPS and radar interferometry, we can map out the earthquake potential and therefore help determine the hazard associated here with the Hayward fault.
Thank you.
With this technology, we're able to watch earthquakes move, landslides, slide down hills, volcano deformation. And given that new satellites are being put into space all the time, we really are now capable of watching every earthquake, every volcano, every landslide at the surface of the Earth, enabling new research, new discovery, and providing new opportunities for science. So let me end again with a picture of members of our group and some snapshots of the research that they've been doing in the last 3 years. And I just want to emphasize again how exciting a time it is to do this research here at Berkeley with these technologies and with these great people. So thanks very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions. And I'll stop sharing.
Great. Thank you so much, Roland. Given the great increase in data that you shared with us from sensors on the ground, as well as monitoring from satellites, what are the prospects for eventually being able to predict earthquakes?
So earthquake prediction is obviously the question I always get asked, not surprisingly. It's awfully hard. We have seen really exciting patterns of deformation, precursory deformation, foreshocks, etc., but nothing common that allows us to determine when, where, how big an earthquake will be on the short term. Now, as many of you know, we can give you a warning of the size of the shaking that will arrive at your location due to early warning systems that measure the earthquake where it happens and give you a warning before the seismic waves arrive at your location. So if you don't have it yet, download the Berkeley MyShake app that Richard Allen at the Berkeley Seismolab put together for everybody to use to be ready for the next big earthquake.
And Roland, that's using the same technology and data that you're using to study the past history of faults?
So it also incorporates and is trying to incorporate more global positioning system, GPS measurements. It obviously relies a lot on seismological observations. And we're still in the process, the Berkeley Seismolab and collaborators, of building out the network of stations that allows us to do that.
Right. Okay, so there's more questions in the chat that we will try and bring all together near the end of our discussion. But we're now going to move on to Claire Doody, who's a graduate student in the Department of Earth and Planetary Science. And she's interested in using the seismic tomography we've heard so much about already to study subduction zone dynamics, where plates at the surface of the Earth go back inside the mantle.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Michael. And thank you again, everyone, for being here today. My journey in the earth sciences also started somewhere flat. I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Chicago in both geophysical sciences and Japanese literature. I graduated there in 2018 and came to Berkeley because Berkeley actually gave me the ability to not only study earth sciences and pursue my passion in seismology, but also to be able to integrate some of the Japanese that I had actually been able to learn in college and beforehand into my studies as well. So I am part of the Allen Group. My advisor is Dr. Richard Allen, who Roland just mentioned is majorly involved in the earthquake early warning effort and the development of MyShake. But another interest of his, and kind of where I fit into the group, is into Earth imaging and seismic tomography. So Harriet showed this image earlier of mantle convection. And here I'm going to focus on just one part of this larger picture, which is the area of subduction zones. So what exactly is a subduction zone, and why is this something that we as seismologists and seismic tomographers care about knowing more on? So here I have a diagram of a subduction zone. So what you see here is this darker orange plate on the right-hand side, and then this lighter orange plate on the left-hand side coming together in the direction that those arrows show. I realize that the background doesn't make it make my fingers stand out. But essentially what you have is two plates coming together, and the oceanic plate on the right-hand side is denser than the continental plate on the left-hand side, and so then gets forced back down into the mantle. And the reason why these subduction zones are of such importance and of interest to scientists is that they're areas with a significant amount of hazard to human populations. Firstly, we have this locked interface area, and those are areas where we can get the largest earthquakes, like the 2011 Tohoku-oki earthquake that occurred in Japan, or the possible earthquake that can occur in the Pacific Northwest in the Cascadia subduction zone. These earthquakes can also cause tsunamis, which can have severe and significant impact to communities close to the shore as well. And then melting as the plate descends further down into the mantle causes volcanoes to erupt at the surface, which can be hazardous in terms of the material that is spewed from the volcano, and also in terms of ash interrupting travel and other processes, and essentially, other things on Earth. And so how do we figure out more about these subduction zones? What I showed you before was a pretty simple layered image. Kind of, if I go back for a second, it looks a little bit like a cake in certain ways. So this seems pretty simplified. Is this subduction process actually as simple as we show it here? So as Harriet mentioned earlier, seismic tomography works a lot like a CT scan that you would get at a hospital. For a CT scan, you have a machine where you have a human subject inside that you're interested in kind of looking at the interior of the body. You have an X-ray source on one side, the detectors on the other. And then you use X-rays that penetrate through the body, and depending on how quickly or how slowly they are able to make it from the source to the detector, you can create images like this of the back of someone's neck that can tell you about exactly what's happening in the interior of someone's body. And in seismology, we can use the exact same process, but instead of using X-rays, we use earthquakes and the ripples and waves associated with earthquakes. And the detectors we have are seismic stations that are placed at the surface. So I'd like to show you some images of Japan, again, my study area in this. Japan is really interesting to study because it has multiple subduction zones that come together in one place. And so if we're looking for complexity, this is one place to get it. And so I would like to talk a little bit about that today. And so here I'm showing a tomographic image. So these blue areas right here are areas where the waves travel faster, where we get faster measurements. And that normally translates, or we think it translates, to material that is colder than the material surrounding it. And these red areas right here are areas where the waves travel much more slowly. And so those are areas that we expect to be hotter and possibly more buoyant as well than the mantle surrounding it. And so what I'm showing here is the Pacific plate is shown kind of by this gray line. So that's the edge of the plate there. And then this blue area is where we think the plate is based off of our images. And then down here with the black line, I'm showing the Philippine Sea plate, which is another plate that subducts, underneath Japan. And so what you'll see here is that the Pacific plate has a very straight line that I've kind of drawn in. It's not jagged or anything at all. There's no spacing. However, when you look at the Philippine Sea plate over on this side, you'll see that I have drawn the lines in two separate sections. And when you look in between the sections, you see this warmer material in the middle. If we had a layered subduction model, like I showed up at the beginning, you would expect something similar to what we have at the Pacific plate up here. However, what we see with the Philippine Sea Plate is that there's actually this gap in the middle. And obviously that's not something that we expect. And so this is pointing to the fact that maybe our model isn't, or maybe the model of subduction with the layers that we showed earlier isn't as accurate as we think that it is. And so this is a depth slice that I'm showing you at 100 kilometers depth. And I'd like to show one at 350 kilometers depth as well, just to give you an idea of the fact that this is a continuing feature, that at 100 kilometers depth, we see it there as well. But as you continue to go deeper down into the mantle, you still continue to see this feature existing. So if we're looking just in the context of our model, it seems like this is a feature and not an artifact. The subduction zone in the Philippine Sea Plate in the southwestern region of Japan is a lot more complex than we think it is. But the best way to try to figure out if that is actually true or not is to compare our results with that of other models. And so here's another model that I'm showing from a group in northeastern Japan. The red lines and the blue lines here show the contours of the subducting plate. The numbers there indicate the depth in kilometers. And so this is just looking in northwestern Japan at the subduction of the Philippine Sea Plate. So if I were to take our model and superimpose it on top of the model of this group here, you'll see that the areas where we find the Philippine Sea Plate, these dark blue areas right here, and also right in here, coincide where this model also sees the plate. And that the area where we have red material right here, so where we think that there's an absence of the plate, they also don't see any indication of the plate in their models either. So what this means is that instead of subducting kind of in one piece, like we would expect from the images that I showed, excuse me, at the beginning, what we're actually seeing is that this plate has torn at some point. So instead of this one bit, you have essentially two bits that have subducted. And so there's some level of destruction that's happened to the plate once it's been subducted. So part of my research and a lot of what I focus on here is why this specific discontinuity exists. And the theory and the hypothesis that I've been working on for my PhD thesis is that volcanoes can actually cause tears in these plates in very specific situations. So a lot of the volcanoes that you'll see here in these red triangles are from the melting that I showed in the subduction zone diagram earlier on. So those are coincident with subduction zones and in areas where we expect there to be volcanoes. However, these larger brown triangles over to the left-hand side are in areas that we don't expect there to be volcanoes. They're much further away from the subduction zone, so that our current or like the idea that we have doesn't necessarily make sense. And so my hypothesis and my theory is that these plumes that come from much further down into the mantle and feed these volcanoes in Korea and in China actually can cause these plates to be torn apart. And so that is kind of a little bit about my research. And yeah, thank you again for listening. And I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you so much, Claire. Why is it that you decided to become a geoscientist? Was there some moment?
Yeah, no, there's a lot of moments, but one in particular kind of stands out. So my father was in the military growing up, and so I moved around a lot as a child. And one place that I remember living very well is in Japan. And my mother's favorite story to tell is that Japan obviously has a lot of earthquakes. And so we would feel shaking in the home and my mom would be really nervous and there's dishes rattling and everything. And I would get so excited and was fascinated by all of what was happening. And so she tells that story a lot, particularly now. And as I moved on to different places, I didn't necessarily continue with that interest until I got to college. And I took a math class. I hated math before college. And then I took this math class where I was able to see the connection between these abstract math concepts that I didn't like and these actual physical processes that are happening on the Earth. And for me, that was kind of a tipping point where I realized that this is something that I wanted to do because I've never been as excited about something as I was about that class.
So below Japan, you showed us that the slab was ripping apart. Is that something that happens in other places?
Yeah, so it does. We've also noticed this in the Pacific Northwest in Cascadia. So models by former group members of the Allen Group have shown a very similar tear that exists in Cascadia. And obviously the Yellowstone supervolcano is just to the east of that and coincides very well geographically with that tear. So actually another part of my PhD thesis, and ties back to a question that was asked earlier for Harriet, is that I'm actually trying to use full waveform inversion instead of just travel time tomography to create a higher resolution of the Pacific Northwest and of California. I'm doing that in collaboration with Lawrence Livermore National Lab. And so my hope there is to create a higher resolution image using full waveform inversion techniques to be able to better image this area and try to understand more about these tears.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's such a deep connection between subduction and volcanism.
Yeah.
Maybe one last quick question. Why did you decide to come to Berkeley? There's so many other places you could have gone.
Yeah, so what really stood out for me for Berkeley was the community in the Earth and Planetary Sciences department. When I came out here to visit, I was greeted with open arms from faculty and students alike. And one of the things that I saw is that there was a huge push towards collaboration for students when you came here. Other places that I went, and I won't name names, there felt like there was a lot of competition in between graduate students, and that faculty members looked down in a sense on graduate students, that you kind of did your time and then you got there over, or like you were able to kind of gain seniority as you went. Whereas Berkeley was the exact opposite, that faculty members were really interested in what I was doing and how their research can fit in with my research and how we can kind of help each other to kind of advance science. So that for me is what stood out about Berkeley. And kind of when I came here, it was, what's it called? No
Thanks,
time before I
Claire.
signed on the dotted line.
Thanks, Claire. When you say that now, it makes me blush a little bit.
So we do have to move on. So next up is Michael Manga, who is our department chair and professor at EPS, and he will talk about his own research now.
Thank you. You know, going back to the foundation of our department in 1868, we've been leading in the study of volcanoes, and a large fraction of the people studying volcanoes and the rocks they produce were educated and trained at Berkeley or are graduates from Berkeley. There's still many open questions, however, and in my own work, we study volcanoes on Earth, Mars, the icy moons in the outer solar system to try and answer questions such as, why do we have volcanoes at all? Why do they erupt in so many different ways? How do volcanoes impact climate and vice versa? And more recently, what I'll highlight today is how volcanoes erupt under the ocean and what are some of the impacts of those eruptions. So roughly 85% of Earth's volcanism happens beneath the sea. Yet we've documented fewer than one submarine eruption per year over the last 30 years. And for comparison, about 100 different volcanoes erupt on land every year. So despite all the modern technology at our disposal, we're probably aware of perhaps 1 in 1,000 submarine eruptions. Well, in 2012, the deep submarine Havre volcano located in the Kermadec volcanic arc north of New Zealand erupted, the largest submarine eruption we know of in the past 400 years. This eruption created a large raft of floating pumice. Pumice is a volcanic rock full of bubbles. And to show you that it floats, I have a piece collected in New Zealand. It washed up in New Zealand. And I can't see myself. This is rounded rock, rounded because it floated for a long time. And I'll put it in the beaker of water. And you can see that indeed it does float. So highlighting the challenge in identifying submarine eruptions, the scientific community was not even aware of this eruption until 2 weeks later, when a passenger in a commercial airplane saw the raft and contacted a volcanologist. While using satellite images, it's possible to identify the initiation of the eruption. Different colors on the left show the position of this raft with a 40-kilometer scale bar at different times. Brown shows the raft 1 day after the eruption, and already it covered more than 400 square kilometers of the ocean. And we can identify where the volcano is located. And these rafts are more than just curiosities. They're colonized by life, and they transport that life great distances. Well, there are many open questions that ultimately affect the impact of eruptions and drive our research. How much erupted and how fast? What was the style of the eruption? Was it explosive like Mount St. Helens in 1980? Or what we call effusive like Mount St. Helens in the 2000s to make this lava dome? How is it that pumice got from the seafloor at a depth of 1 kilometer up to the ocean surface? And what do deposits from submarine eruptions actually look like? Well, to answer these questions, we undertook the mapping, exploration, and sampling at Havre expedition with 12 students and 11 researchers. We use the remotely operated vehicle Jason on the left to collect samples and take imagery, and the autonomous underwater vehicle Sentry to do high resolution mapping. And we discovered that the eruption that made that raft of floating pumice was accompanied by the eruption of 14 new lava flows and lava domes, pictured here and colored in. A distinctive deposit from these submarine eruptions is a large field of what we call giant pumice. The bumps you can see in this background image, and these bumps are individual pieces of pumice that are more than 1 meter in diameter. And some of these get quite large. And I guess I should probably point out that volcanoes on land do not erupt rocks nearly this big. I have a short little video to give you a sense of what an expedition at sea is like, although the expedition, of course, is 6 weeks. So here's sentries being lowered to make the high resolution map of the seafloor, to image the caldera, the big crater, and the fresh lava flows, as well as the field of giant pumice. Here's Jason being lowered to the seafloor. Just controlling Jason from the ship requires a team of 6 people working around the clock. So Jason makes a variety of different geophysical measurements, takes images. So here's the pieces of giant pumice. It's 6 feet across in this image. And we can collect a 1.5 meter piece of pumice from the seafloor. Well, based on hundreds of samples, lab experiments, and computer simulations, we can paint a quantitative picture of this eruption, illustrated schematically here. I'm not going to take you through all the details, but briefly, the eruption rate started high, similar to Mount St. Helens in 1980. Very bubbly rock erupted that floated up to the ocean surface to make the raft. A smaller fraction of these pieces of pumice sank to the seafloor to make the giant pumice you saw in the video. Over time, the eruption rate decreased. Gases were lost as the magma was rising. Now a more dense magma erupts into the ocean to make a lava flow. These raft-forming eruptions are not that rare. Here a bit further north, near Tonga, where the red triangle is located, in August 2019, the sailing vessel encountered a raft of pumice that stretches off to the horizon. This fortunately also gives us access to fresh samples. Well, we can use satellite monitoring of these rafts to test models that forecast where the raft is going to travel as it's carried by ocean currents, by wind, and by waves. On the top is a forecast of how much pumice will go over the ocean surface. And on the bottom in color is how long it takes for pumice to get to that location. And sure enough, in late August, the first pumice started rafting onto the Great Barrier Reef this year. And these forecasts were communicated to shipping authorities every 2 weeks. So what next? Originally this month and next month, we were supposed to be on 2 back-to-back cruises, a fancy name for going to sea. The first was to study the evolution of the hydrothermal systems fed by the volcano and the recovery of the disturbed biological seafloor communities. The second cruise was to study prehistoric, much larger eruptions. Something made this caldera, and those were much larger eruptions. If you look at the seafloor around this caldera, you can see features that look like large waves of sediment. And we hypothesized that these are made by underwater equivalents of the of large pyroclastic flows. And this would have been an eruption bigger than anything we have witnessed in modern human history. So just to summarize, on land, there's no equivalent of these submarine eruptions. The physical processes are affected by the ocean, and most of what erupts gets carried away far from the volcano. For me, this project was a great reminder of the value of international and interdisciplinary collaboration. And so far, 5 different PhD students have completed dissertations based on data we were able to collect.
Thank you, Michael. So one quick question is, well, how does a student, a Berkeley student, get to be a member of this cruise and participate in this exciting work?
Well, there are a couple parts to go to see. First, of course, you have to get the ship. And this particular ship was the University of California managed Roger Revelle. But we need the ship for 4 to 8 weeks. It's got to be in the right location. And ships have a certain number of berths, and we need a certain number of scientists with different types of expertise. So you try and match the space available and the expertise. And on the next 2 cruises, we should have room for a couple Berkeley students. Then, of course, we have to find the funding to support the students. We do this by writing proposals to the National Science Foundation.
That's great. We have a question from Thomas Klein, and he asked, was there any corresponding change in ocean chemistry as a result of these eruptions?
Yeah, so something I did not highlight, but I showed you that piece of pumice and it was rounded. It started off its life as something 2 meters in diameter, and as it's floating on the ocean surface, they're jostling against each other. They get abraded, and ash settles into the ocean, and that ash can fertilize the ocean, providing, in this part of the ocean, phosphorus and iron are often the limiting elements, and the glass does dissolve. And so there are often plankton blooms associated with these submarine eruptions.
So a related question, how is life around the volcano or elsewhere affected by this process?
Well, you can imagine that an eruption of 3 to 4 cubic kilometers of rock is going to devastate the local communities that live on the seafloor. But the hydrothermal vents that are heated by the underground and surface lava flows do support rich ecosystems of interesting life because it's not photosynthetic. And so in the videos, we can see those communities living on the seafloor. And the pumice itself provides fresh nutrients and a great substrate. And so very quickly, these submarine deposits get colonized.
And we have a question from our very own Walter Alvarez. Have pumice rafts been recognized in the stratigraphic record? They should be all over.
And when Professor Alvarez talks about stratigraphic record, that just means as we go through Earth history, materials get deposited one on top of the other. We've been drilling into the ocean's seafloor for all kinds of reasons, partly to study climate, but also to study submarine geological processes. And it's extremely common to encounter little pieces of pumice that have no obvious origin. And they're from these rafts that are circumnavigating the planet. Eventually the pumice sinks. And when it sinks, it gets preserved in the stratigraphic record. And so we are trying to put together a record of submarine volcanism based on these kinds of records that have previously been largely ignored.
And you showed us a picture of Mount St. Helens, very destructive eruption. How dangerous can these submarine volcanoes, volcanic eruptions be for us?
For the most part, submarine eruptions are pretty harmless. The fact that we know of, say, 1 out of 1,000 is an indication that they can't be that devastating. On the other hand, planes should not fly through volcanic ash and boats should not travel through pumice. It's abrasive. But probably the biggest threat to us and people, by that I mean people, from submarine eruptions are the hazards from tsunamis. Anak Krakatoa created a tsunami in December of 2018 that killed at least 373 people in Indonesia. The 1883 Krakatoa eruption created a 100-foot tall tsunami that killed more than 30,000 people. So actually, volcanic tsunamis are responsible for 1/4 of the fatalities associated with volcanoes.
Because we have a couple more minutes, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your next expedition and what you hope to discover then.
Right, I wonder if I can go back. And so one of my objectives today in the 5 minutes was to give you a sense that submarine eruptions are fundamentally different because of the ocean. That in this case, almost everything gets carried away from the volcano. But at the same time, we do create a volcano around that caldera. And features called pyroclastic flows are generated because the material that erupts is more dense than the air, and it collapses and travels down the flanks of the volcano. And the eruption that would have made this caldera would be probably 50 times bigger than Mount St. Helens was in 1980. And so this is why we think the eruptive material probably collapsed and created these kinds of flows extending from the volcano. So we're hoping to get some insight into even larger submarine eruptions. In fact, one of the big challenges in volcano science is we have not seen very large eruptions in our lifetime, but they're surely going to happen. And we don't know how they work in different ways than the ones we have seen.
Very exciting. Thank you, Michael. There's one more question I do have, because we have another minute. How much does your research intersect with what Claire showed us. She showed us subducting systems which are clearly associated with volcanoes.
Right. So this particular volcano, and going from New Zealand all the way up to Tonga, all the volcanoes are under the ocean. But they are produced by the processes Claire talked about, the process of subduction that gives rise to what we call a volcanic arc. And in this particular setting, they're mostly underwater. Yeah, but Claire also highlighted that we're trying to understand why Yellowstone exists. Why is there a volcano so far away from a plate boundary? And she hypothesized that it was a slab tearing apart. And these are the biggest eruptions that have occurred in the last 2 million years in Earth history. And so we're interested in trying to understand, well, why are those eruptions so big? And why do they occur where they occur?
Thank you, Michael. And I think we have to move on. So I'll hand it back to you to help us wrap up the evening.
Great. So in closing, I am going to hand the floor back over to Frances Hellman, Dean of the Division of Math and Physical Sciences and President-elect of the American Physical Society. Frances is also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's also a professor in physics. Specifically, she's a condensed matter experimentalist. She studies the thermodynamic properties of novel solid materials, especially thin films, semiconducting, superconducting, and magnetic materials. So take it away, Frances.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Harriet, Roland, Claire, for sharing all this with all of us, and a glimpse into how closely we're able to view and understand the movement of these the tectonic plates on our Earth. It's such a joy to get to participate in these sorts of events. It's really the absolute best part of being dean, is to get to listen to all the fantastic science that everybody's doing, and listening to you convey the excitement. Your own excitement about your research. It's contagious, and it's just a great reminder of why we all are here at Berkeley. It's, it's breathtaking. It's just to hear of the discoveries and to see what you're doing and how you're doing it. The how part is, since I'm an experimentalist, the how part is always particularly intriguing. I also want to say a special thank you to our alumni and friends for gathering and talking about the importance of basic science. This series of science talks is intended to shine a light on the foundational science and to convey its importance in all of our scientific endeavors. Someday we hope to do something about climate change, and we hope to understand and predict volcanoes and so forth. But meantime, we have to do the basic science, and it's just a joy to hear. In other words, we have to fully understand the movement of the Earth's plates if we're ever going to be able to mitigate earthquakes and sea level rise. I do think that Berkeley, and the University of California for that matter, has done a great job of showing the world, with its recent Nobel Prize wins, that basic science is a key to progress and innovation. Prizes and events like this one are a great way to demonstrate to the world how important our work is. I am no doubt preaching to the choir, but these days we are put in the position of having to defend our work as scientists, and you guys are great advocates. For reasons like that, all of your support, all the people on this call, your support and your advocacy for Cal means everything to us and to the faculty, Michael, Harriet, Roland, and our graduate student Claire. We are extremely gratified for your continued interest in Berkeley, which is alma mater to so many of you, and to the path-breaking work that's being done here. If there's anything you want to learn more about, or if you'd like to support our work, for which there is, of course, a deep need, please be in touch with us. We absolutely want you to be part of advancing basic science and discovery at Berkeley. And with that, I will end with a rousing fiat lux, and be well.